Should I field? Yeah. Philip, go ahead.
Just clarification on your overall view of how we should be approaching these matters. I mean, it seems to me a reasonable question and an important real-world question.
Yeah.
What reasons ought to motivate us when we punish people? Should they be merely consequential, or is there some other kind of retributive? I mean, that's a question about the real world. And I can't see how to make progress on that question. I just can't, without at some point doing something like philosophy in the traditional sense, asking whether something like basic desert makes sense. I mean, you said we could look to the law courts, but I mean, there's no a priori reason to think that our current law practice. I mean, it's not as extreme as getting rid of the legal system. I mean, the question is, can it be improved in some way? There's no a priori reason.
Of course.
Yeah, but I can't see how to work out whether it ought to be changed. This without doing something like.
Well, that's fine. I mean, you can do that if you like. But the point I kind of want to make is that there's a lot more wisdom in the criminal justice system than you might think.
Created by philosophers in the past. Created by
experience.
I'm talking about the judgments of juries and judges. I'm talking about how case law actually works. And it's very, very interesting. So I think that there are many reasons why punishment has to happen. And you might think that retribution is unacceptable and you're just going to take that line and say it's moral because we're treating somebody as an end or means and not as an end. And so I don't care. The fact of the matter is, unless you punish people, unless you have a well-organized system for doing such, people will take the law into their own hands. And if you don't think that's ugly, I can suggest a lot of books.
No, but people might be getting, the death penalty because there's certain retributive aspects of our punishment system which might be immoral, and so.
Well, then there's always appropriate for you to argue against that. I just want to make the point that yes, retribution is part of our system, but there's a good reason why it is, and that is a very practical reason which any judge will hasten to explain to you, and that is that if you don't have some method for incarcerating and punishing people, others will take it into their own hands. Rough justice or posse justice or vigilante justice is awful.
You misunderstand what I'm saying there. I'm not saying there shouldn't be punishment, but what is the reasons in the law? What are the reasons? Is it purely consequentialist or is it to some degree retributive?
The law doesn't do it that way. I mean, that's the kind of interesting thing. I mean, one of the points that I love Steve Morse for. Steve Morse is quite wonderful on this topic. And, he's a jurist at Penn. And he understands very well that the law is rooted in very, very practical social considerations. And when people raise this issue about free will and so forth, he said, I can't find it anywhere in the law about free will. There's nothing there. And he's right. It's not there. Why isn't it there? Well, because in a way, I think, and several people made this point, we kind of adopted Aristotle's view, which is the default is that you are responsible. And if you can provide exceptions that are acceptable, then we may take that into account in the guilt phase or in the sentencing phase. And so he recognized, in the Nicomachean Ethics, he has this beautiful passage where he just lays it out. Sounds like Anglo-American law. And so he treats the case of a mad person, only he doesn't have that vocabulary. So he says, if someone does not know who he is or what it is that he's doing, then that is a kind of excuse. But at the same time, he recognizes that these people can be very dangerous, even if they are, as we would say, legally insane. And so it isn't, these things are not straightforward. So, you know, that you can say it's just consequentialist or it's just retributive or
both.
It's a mix.
And one part might be just wrong.
Then go for it. Then, you know, you then do the work to show that. And whether people will accept that or not as a matter of practical focus is another issue. I mean, there is no doubt that if someone is a sexual offender and likes to rape and torture little children and then kill them, and you say, well, you know, you can't really punish them because that would be retribution. If I was the mom, I'd rip the guy apart with my own hands. I would have no trouble. If the criminal justice system wouldn't do it, I would. And there's a lot of folks like me. Nothing interesting follows. Just read Aristotle. Yeah.
Philosophy. Question. So it seems to me that the solution for free will discussion very much depends on where you start.
Yes.
And you seem to start from the obvious cases like criminal law, called criminal practice. Yes. So if you start with criminal practice, then I mean there is already criminal responsibility. So you'll, by definition, avoid the solution that, you know, Dirk's, for instance, idea of the absence of free will, because you already have that. I think the other option is to start with folks' belief about responsibility. And it's a little more difficult because we don't really understand what the folks believe. As soon as the folks understand the question, they start to believe something else. So, or it becomes confusion.
Yeah.
And you also can start with the third option, which is the causal structure of the world. So either it's deterministic or indeterministic, and so that's as I understand, this is another starting point. So and I think that the starting point actually defines the outcome. I mean, very much depending where you start, it's like with the intentional stance. You start with intentional stance, and you may come up with multiple drafts or something like that. If you start with evidence, like qualia, then you end up in maybe panpsychism or some other. So my question is to both of you, actually, to you and to Dirk. So how do you justify where you start? I mean, it is of course easier to start with something that's already obvious and like criminal practice. But how do you justify this? And maybe Dirk can also answer that. What is your starting point? And my next question is to Pat, and very simple, and this is just out of curiosity. So what are the differences between the addictive ways of getting a hedonic response and non-addictive ways of getting a hedonic response? Is there any, I think if you can start with the second question.
Yeah, so for example, say listening to a piece of music that you
Or
really like.
talking philosophy and getting a lot of, and then you have to have more and more. Yeah, that's what I'm getting usually, yes. Or maybe sex, or maybe playing games, you know, or something like this.
People are looking into that, but what we think is special in the case of these substances is that they bind to the receptors in a very different way in which normally receptors are bound, for example, just by dopamine. And so they are mimicking the neurochemicals that are made by your own brain. So in the case of heroin, for example, you might say, well, why does heroin fit that particular receptor? Why is it like that? I mean, did God do that? And the answer is your brain actually makes its own opioids. And it does that because it releases them in all kinds of conditions, some of which are in a parenting situation, some of which are in a painful situation when you need to move, and so on and so forth. But they bind, so an endogenous opioid will bind to the receptor, and then it will denature quite quickly. And that's not the case with things like cocaine, heroin, and nicotine. And so there are those kinds of differences. Having said that, however, it's a very incomplete answer, because it does seem that given the usual characterization of addiction, some people are addicted to sex, some people are addicted to gambling, and have many of the same after responses in terms of anxiety and tolerate tremendous destruction to their personal lives and their jobs and families and so forth, in just the way that we see happens with substance addictions. And it's not well understood, because getting a population of those individuals and studying them in a way that's meaningful is not something we can do yet. And we can't really addict a rat to gambling yet. I mean, and you might do a transgenic rat that really, you know, is lusty and, you know, just likes to have sex all the time, but we don't have that yet, because we don't know the gene that we would do, with that, you know, we would put in. So I can't really answer that, but those are all really interesting things. But back to your other question, it's, of course, it's not a matter which I can justify completely. It's a matter of finding a place to start that makes sense scientifically and makes sense in those cases where I think any issue of free will really matters. And that's within the context of the criminal justice system and in raising children. And so it's in those contexts that it seems to me, if you're not really paying attention to those, you're apt to go down some funny little rabbit warren and God knows what. So that, but other people may arrive at much more interesting conclusions starting somewhere else. Absolutely. So it's not, I have no a priori justification for it whatsoever, but then I have no a priori justification for anything. For me, I have none.
Just a very
Dirk,
quick response. So I agree with what Pat just said about methodology, but I would say that you know, I probably would. I think it's very important to think about the kind of practical needs of the criminal justice system. But I do think that I agree with Philip that it's also important to think about you know, the extent to which you know, kind of general facts about the universe or neurological facts might impact on justifications of that system, and that may change it. But in the end, I agree with you that look, it's got the criminal justice system has to work, and it has to work with. And it also, I think, one thing you're emphasizing, which I didn't talk about in my quick presentation, is that you know, it has to work in our own kind of social and consumer context.
It has to work. That's, I think, really critical. And you and I think, clearly agree there. And heck, I forgot the point I was going to make. It probably wasn't very important. Anyway, no, actually, I think it was
yeah, and then you reach reflective equilibrium. You can do that, and you reach reflective equilibrium. That's how I want to see it. Yeah, lots of different. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Andy.
Yeah. So I just want to try out a possible implication of the work that you're presenting here and see whether it is an implication. So it seems to me that an implication of this is that the relationship between understanding and what you might think of as a morally relevant notion of self-control is much weaker than we thought it was, and perhaps it even moves in the other direction. It's not that understanding leads to more control, it's that less control leads to less understanding. If that is an implication, that seems like actually quite a sort of conceptually profound implication.
Yeah, and I think that's entirely possible. I mean, I would just be guided by the facts wherever they happen to go. And because, you know, it's really only in the last 15 years that the reward system has been, you know, the major discoveries were made about the reward system so that then we could really begin to go at it. And now I think we'll just have to wait and see where it all goes. And, you know, if there are some things that we have to change as a result, then so be it. But I think, you know, the other point, and maybe this is kind of like what Dirk was trying to say, and that is that, you know, there's a lot of things that one worries about with regard to the criminal justice system, like the drug laws. I worry a lot more about the drug laws than changing people's attitude about whether retribution should have any role in the criminal justice system. There are other laws I worry about a lot more as well. but that just is an indication that I happen to take a very practical road here. And anybody who wants to do the other thing, you know, I'm not saying it's wrong, go do it. It's just that I don't want to continue with you because other people have questions. Yeah.
So I'm on your side about the practical role and the legal implications being the driving motivation behind approaching this issue. I also believe in the relevance of what you're talking about, but I think you're profoundly and dangerously looking in the wrong places in terms of resource allocation. If you look at the biophilia that's driven criminal science in recent years, there has been an absolutely disproportionate and unjustified and pernicious investment of energy in looking for biogenic causes. And so go back to the control system and say, how relevant is this for treating criminal justice? The truth is a lot of criminals are working under full control, but they're working under full control because they're making rational decisions that they're living in a society where criminality is the most rational option for
Bernie
them.
Madoff.
Bernie Madoff, but so in the U.S. in the last 30 years there's been a 6-fold increase in the prison population, disproportionately black, and it's 1 in every 100 Americans is in prison. And it's basically directly related to economic opportunities. So somebody says, okay, well, there's no job opportunities for me, and there's no economic safety net in the form of meaningful welfare. So selling drugs is an appropriate option. Addiction may be an appropriate option. On addiction, 90% of the US budget on addiction goes into biogenic causes. Biogenic causes, when looked at in terms of effect size, account for something like 12% of variance in addiction. The major factors, even within a society, are social. And if you look across countries, the US has 7% alcohol addiction, which is very high. Russia has, I think, approaching 18%, so more than twice as much.
Yeah.
So we have this really rich science, and I know you're on my side too. I mean, I know you write about this stuff too.
I have no objection to what you're suggesting.
But I kind of worry that when we focus on control, we'll end up with the view that that's going to be the, so when a court looks at the case, that's going to be the decider. We should look at whether this is controlled or not. But if you take the idea that culture plays a role here, then control's relevance to attribution of responsibility may drop out.
No, I absolutely agree, of course, about the social factors and their relevance, and the fact that many of the people who are now in prison are there because of drug possession or selling drugs.
Yeah.
And part of the reason, of course, we are also really interested in the neurobiology of addiction is because for those people who are genuinely addicted, be it social as a causal factor or not, we would like to be able to do something to change that. And we need to understand the nature of addiction in order to do that. But yeah, I quite agree. If those factors are really important in shaping the reward system or in shaping what it is that people find to be valuable or preferable or rational given their conditions, we have to take that very seriously. So that's something that I would easily want to embrace.
I guess the danger I'm pointing to is, suppose somebody says, well, I want to invest some time and energy and money into studying criminality, so I'm going to study the musculature of the hand, because it turns out most crimes are committed with the hand. And they do all this work, and it turns out that something about use of handguns depends on certain features of the hands, and not everybody can aim as well, so the people who end up getting criminal culpability are correlated with people who have a certain degree of dexterity, and we say, okay, now we've done this great science of crime. It's totally legitimate, it's totally real science, it's not irrelevant, but I wonder if there's some risk in making this the centerpiece of a story about the science of crime.
There's a huge amount of other kind of work being done. A very famous piece of work, of course, was done by Martha Farah. And the question was to look at, in the scanner, kids who were in homes where they got lots of attention, either from the parents or the caregiver or what have you, lots of love, lots of attention, and so forth, and those who were, by and large, really very neglected. So you look at those kids when they are, I forgot what age it was, 4 or 5. You see a huge difference in the level of prefrontal activity. And that we know is very important and relevant to their capacity for self-control. Now, that's also, of course, a social factor that she's pointing to. So, I mean, I mention that as one amongst many other studies. So it's not, I just kind of think you sort of skewed your story a little bit. That it isn't just that we're doing this stuff because we're getting money and we want to do it for white people or something. But I think that really is a mistake. Dan, you've been
Two suggestions. It really bothers me that for a lot of people, particularly, actually philosophers too, punishment and retribution are as close to synonymous as, and I noticed you several times use the word retribution in a way which I thought, well, you're talking about punishment.
I never use the word in my book.
Well, no, but you used it here, and I thought, oh, please, Pat, don't add to the identification of punishment with retribution, because some of us think. I completely agree with you. I am in hot water in certain quarters for saying I don't want to live in a world without punishment. But I don't mean I don't want to live in a world without retribution.
I don't say that, Dan. I'm very explicit in the book that the practical basis, and I get this from Aristotle and everybody else who's really thought deeply about this, the practical basis for a criminal justice system is public safety. That's what I say.
Okay, but all right, so then that was just a slip of the moment.
Well, I mean, retribution came up in the discussion. And it came up several times. I guess I could have answered it without using the word, but I think that might have been tricky.
The other point is, while I certainly agree with you that it's very frustrating when philosophers address these issues in terms that it's very hard to get scientists to pay attention to and think about, and you more or less think it's a waste of time. I would like to point out that my frustration has been on the other side entirely when I've had to deal with very eminent scientists saying all sorts of really silly things about free will. Wolf Singer, Chris Frith, Paul Bloom, and Lesserlights.
I don't know what they said.
Well, they say basically they say if our actions are determined in the brain, then we don't have free will and we're not responsible. That's what they say.
Okay.
They adopt the most unscientific, anti-scientific option of the free will views, namely libertarianism.
Okay, I mean, in the book.
So what do you do about that?
In the book, which was reviewed by Chris Frith, I do not take the view that if your actions are caused, you have no free will. That whole point is to say, look, because the notion of free will gets so messed up in semantics, I'm going to talk about self-control, and that's really the salient thing here, and it's obvious that it's well within a causal nexus.
Yeah.
So
No,
why are you beating up on me?
No, we're on the same side, but
I would have thought.
We're very much on the same side, and I've been giving talks where I say, look, I'm not going to use the term free will. It's poisoned.
Okay.
I'm going to
Sounds
talk
like
about what I'm going to call moral competence, which is self-control.
That's good too.
But the fact is that the people that we should be frustrated by are not just the philosophers. A lot of amateur philosophy being done by neuroscientists is simply outrageously naive, and I think it's as much. I mean, I have been scolding them. I think you're a good person to scold them too.
I have.
Okay.
I was recently at the Cold Spring Harbor meeting.
Yep.
I was recently at a Cold Spring Harbor meeting, and you couldn't have a more eminent collection of neuroscientists. And I gave them that basic story.
Good,
And the
great.
book has
Then
been
we're on.
very widely read in neuroscience. I gave a gazillion talks on this. I think I'm more clean on this than you think. So I don't understand what your beef is with me.
Oh, just that today you were.
I was trying to explain the
Yeah.
motivation for
Yeah.
why I prefer to use the expression self-control.
Well,
I mean,
yeah.
maybe I should have used the expression moral competence,
No,
and then
no,
I would
that-
have been,
that- no,
you know,
no.
all would have
That
been
wasn't the
well.
point,
But the whole idea was to explain the motivation for using the expression self-control, not as so much as a theory of free will, but as a way of dodging a whole lot
Here.
of discussion that I thought would be uninteresting
Here.
to the kind of people who were reading the book.
Somebody better seize control here.
Yeah.
The leader of this group is now caught in a.
Yeah.
Let us set him free.
Are there other comments people want to make on this? So, thanks very much. Now, it's now 5 o'clock.